Blood and Moonlight. She hunts by moonlight, he hunts with silver. The thing they're hunting is hunting both of them. A story by AshBorne. The scent hit Sable first, a violation of nature, a stench that clawed at her senses like broken glass. Blood and fur and something else, something metallic and wrong that made her 2 centuries of predator instincts scream in protest. She moved faster than thought, the night air parting around her as she flowed through the pine forest, her bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. Her twin curved blades, cold against her palms, were extensions of her will. This wasn't a hunt. This was an intrusion. Something had broken the rules of their world, and her ancient bones vibrated with the wrongness of it. The village appeared ahead, smoke rising from chimneys, the warm, comforting scent of human life. But beneath it, beneath the wood smoke and cooking fires, was that same wrongness, amplified, closer. She pushed faster, the trees blurring into streaks of black and silver, her vampire senses drinking in every detail of the night. Then she saw it, in the village square. Standing over a crumpled form, a man in a tanner's apron. The thing had the pale, unnaturally smooth skin of a vampire, but stretched over it was a coat of matted, dark fur. Its fingers, too many fingers, each ending in claws that curved like scimitars, were buried in the man's chest. Blood, thick and dark, coated its hands and forearms. Its head was wrong, too many angles, too many teeth, rows upon rows of fangs, like a shark's mouth lining its entire jawline. Its eyes, when they lifted from its meal, were both gold and red at the same time, swirling with a madness that made Sable's own centuries-old control tremble. A sound escaped the thing, a wet guttural growl that was also a hiss, a sound that didn't belong in any throat. It turned its head, sniffing the air, and Sable saw the joints bend at impossible angles, backward hinges on its elbows and knees. Silver-resistant hide, she realized with a cold dread she hadn't felt since her turning. This was no vampire, no werewolf. This was an abomination. The villager gasped, a final, rattling breath. The thing dropped the body and stood, sniffing the air again, its head tilting. It had smelled her. The predator in her roared, demanding action, but the scholar in her, the part of her that had survived 2 centuries of war and politics, urged caution. This was unknown. This was dangerous. Too late. The thing's red-gold eyes locked onto her position in the shadows. It let out another of those wrong growls and charged, moving with a speed that shouldn't be possible for something so massive. The ground shook with its approach. Sable moved, not to flee but to engage. She flowed forward, a blur of motion, her blades singing as they cleared their sheaths. The hybrid swung a clawed hand that would have cleaved a normal human in two, but Sable was already gone, a flicker of black on the edge of its perception. She circled, faster than thought, her blades leaving shallow cuts on its silver-resistant hide. Nothing. The hide was too tough, too thick. It was like trying to slash stone. It turned, enraged, its movements a grotesque parody of grace. Sable ducked under a swing that would have decapitated her, slashing at its exposed knee. Her blade bit deep, drawing black ichor that smelled of burned metal and decay. Her blade bit deep, drawing black ichor that smelled of burned metal and decay. The thing screamed, a sound that vibrated Sable's teeth in her skull and backhanded her with enough force to send her flying. She hit the wooden wall of a cottage with a sickening crack. Plaster and wood splintered around her as she crashed through into the darkness within. Pain, a sensation she hadn't truly felt in decades, lanced through her. She pushed herself up, tasting blood in her mouth. Vampires didn't bleed easily. This thing had hurt her, badly. Outside, she heard the hybrid roar, then another sound, a deep human grunt, the clash of metal on something hard. Another hunter, impossible. No human moved that fast. Gideon's nostrils flared. The screams had drawn him first, the raw terror of humans always cut through the night air like a knife. But beneath it, beneath the fear and the blood, was something else. A wrongness that made the hair on his arms stand up. He'd hunted werewolves his entire adult life, vampires before that. He knew their scents, their sounds, their kills. This was different. This was corrupted. He pushed through the trees, his greatsword a familiar weight on his back, his silver throwing knives cool against his hip. The village came into view, chaos, people running, screaming, and in the center of it all a nightmare. A creature that was both vampire and wolf, tearing into a man with claws that were too long, too many. It had the pale skin of a bloodsucker, but the fur and brutish strength of a lycanthrope. Its movements were a perversion of everything he knew. Then he saw her. A figure moving with impossible speed, a blur of dark hair and twin curved blades. A vampire. She struck at the thing, her blades leaving only shallow scratches on its hide. The hybrid backhanded her, sending her flying through the wall of a cottage. Gideon's training took over, assessed the threat, neutralized the greater danger first. The vampire was a known quantity. This abomination was an unknown variable, a threat to everything. He drew his greatsword, the silver blade humming with power in his hand, and charged. The hybrid turned, its red-gold eyes fixing on him. It lunged, a blur of fur and fangs. Gideon met it, his sword swinging in a heavy arc. The blade connected with the thing's shoulder with a sound like striking an anvil. Sparks flew, but the blade didn't bite deep. The hide was silver-resistant, but not immune. It was tougher than anything he'd ever faced. The hybrid roared and swiped at him. Gideon dodged, the claws tearing through his leather coat, scoring his shoulder. Pain flared, but he ignored it, his mind already calculating. The hide was thickest on the torso, the limbs, but the joints, knees, elbows, the back of the neck seemed more vulnerable, a weakness. He saw the vampire Sable, he realized with a jolt, though he'd never met her, emerge from the ruined wall, blood on her lips but her eyes burning with predatory fire. She saw him, saw the silver in his hand, and for a fraction of a second he saw recognition in her eyes. The enemy, but the hybrid was between them, a greater threat. It turned back to her, its attention divided. That was his opening. "Distract it," he yelled, his voice raw. "Its knees." Sable moved. A flicker of shadow and motion, she was in front of the hybrid, her blades a silver whirlwind. She slashed at its face, scoring its cheek, drawing more of that black, foul-smelling ichor. She slashed at its face, scoring its cheek, drawing more of that black, foul-smelling ichor. The hybrid screamed, turning its full attention on her, its movements clumsy with rage. Gideon circled, his heart pounding, the wound on his shoulder throbbing. He saw his chance, the back of the hybrid's knee where the hide seemed to thin. He lunged, his greatsword leading, and drove the silver blade deep into the joint. The sound that erupted was worse than its scream, a wet tearing followed by a gurgling choke. The hybrid went down, thrashing, trying to reach the sword embedded in its leg. Sable was on it in an instant, her blades finding its throat, slicing through the flesh and muscle with inhuman strength. One final wet gasp and it was still. They stood over the corpse, breathing hard, the night suddenly silent except for the crackle of fire and the distant sobs of the villagers. Gideon looked at the vampire. Her red eyes were fixed on him, her twin blades still dripping black blood. He looked at his own greatsword, the silver blade stained with the same foul ichor. Centuries of war between their species screamed in his blood. "Kill her now, before she turns on you," but she didn't move, she just watched him, her expression unreadable. He saw intelligence there, calculation, not the mindless rage of a bloodsucker. And she had helped kill this thing. Gideon sheathed his sword with a metallic rasp, a gesture of trust, a gesture of pragmatism. The bigger threat was gone, for now he met her gaze. "What was that?" His voice was rough, unused to speaking after the fight. Sable wiped her blades on the hybrid's fur, cleaning them. She looked from the corpse to Gideon, her red eyes searching his face. "Something that shouldn't exist," she said, her voice low like velvet over steel. "Something new and dangerous." She turned to leave, melting into the shadows at the edge of the village. Before she was gone, she caught his scent, pine and iron and something else, old grief that was as familiar to her as her own. She was gone before he could blink, faster than any living creature had a right to move. Gideon stood alone in the moonlit square, the hybrid's corpse between him and the darkness where the vampire had disappeared. He touched the wound on his shoulder, the pain a sharp reminder of the night's events. He had never seen anything like that creature, never imagined such a thing could exist, and the vampire, Sable, she had fought with a skill that bordered on the inhuman, and she had helped him. He looked at the hybrid one last time, at the impossible way its limbs were bent, at the rows of fangs in its ruined throat. This was a new kind of war, and he was not prepared for it. Sable moved through the forest, the night air cool against her face, washing away the scent of blood and wrongness. She didn't run, not yet, she needed to think. 2 centuries of hunting, of war, of surviving in a world that hated her kind, and she had never been afraid, not truly, until tonight. That creature, it had moved with impossible strength, its hide resistant to her blades. It had hurt her. Vampires healed quickly, faster than humans, faster than werewolves, but the pain had been real. The wound on her shoulder, already knitting closed, had throbbed with a venom that wasn't physical. It was the fear that came with the unknown. It was the fear that came with the unknown. She stopped beneath the canopy of ancient pines, the moonlight filtering through the branches in silver shafts. She closed her eyes, trying to sort through the sensory input, the scent of pine and damp earth, the sound of her own breathing, the phantom taste of hybrid blood in her mouth. But beneath it all was that wrongness, that violation of nature that had drawn her to the village in the first place. Someone had created that thing. Someone had broken the boundaries between vampire and werewolf. two species that had warred for a millennium, two predators that naturally competed for territory and prey. Someone had made them into one, and if they had made one, they could make more. The thought sent a cold dread through her that had nothing to do with the night air. Her coven under Lady Vera's command controlled the northern territories. They were powerful, ancient, but they were not invincible, if there were more of those hybrids. If they were stronger, faster. She opened her eyes, the red glow in them faint in the darkness. She had to warn Lady Vera, she had to find out who was responsible, but as she turned to continue her journey, a new scent caught on the night breeze. Pine and iron and old grief, the werewolf-hunter. He had moved fast, faster than any human should, and he had known how to kill the hybrid. He had known about the weak points in the joints. His knowledge hadn't been learned in a single fight. It had been trained into him. He was a professional, a hunter of monsters, and he had helped her, not because he liked vampires, but because the hybrid was a greater threat, a threat to both of them. Sable shook her head, a rare flicker of something like confusion crossing her features. The world was changing, the rules were breaking. And she was standing at the edge of a new kind of war, a war where the enemy was a perversion of everything she knew, and the only ally she had was a silver-eyed werewolf hunter who would just as soon kill her as look at her. She moved on, faster now, the wind whistling past her ears. She had to get back to Vera, she had to prepare. Because if there was one thing her 2 centuries of life had taught her, it was that when the rules break, the predators get hungry. And something was creating very, very hungry predators. Gideon's fingers tightened around the worn leather of his greatsword's hilt as he crouched in the tall grass, the silver-coated metal cool against his skin. 2 weeks. That's how long it had been since he'd last crossed paths with the vampire Sable. 2 weeks of hunting hybrids alone, of finding torn bodies and drained corpses, of his guild losing 2 more hunters to the abominations. The numbers were escalating faster than he could track. He moved with practiced silence, his hunter's senses stretched thin, searching for the wrongness in the night air. The hybrid he was tracking tonight was large, werewolf-sized by the prints in the mud, but with an irregular gait that spoke of something unnatural. He followed the trail through the farmland, the scent of damp earth and crushed vegetation filling his nostrils. Then, beneath the copper tang of blood that marked the hybrid's passage, he caught it. Vampire. Not the usual metallic tang of his own kind, but something else, older, colder, with an edge of night-blooming jasmine that he'd only smelled once before. His body tensed, hand going to the silver daggers at his belt. He rounded a thicket of blackberry bushes, blade half drawn, and stopped. She was there, standing motionless in the moonlight, her dark hair like spilled ink against her pale skin. Sable. She was watching the same trail he was, her dual curved blades held loosely in her hands. For a moment the old hatred surged, silver and blood, predator and hunter. But it was a reflex, an echo of 100 years of war that felt distant and hollow in the face of these new monsters. She turned her head and their eyes met across 20 feet of moonlit field. There was no posturing this time, no bared fangs or threatening stances, just the acknowledgement of a shared hunt. Sable gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Gideon returned it, professional courtesy between predators who'd fought the same enemy. They moved then, not as allies, but as 2 hunters who understood the rules of this new game. The hybrid was ahead, moving through a cornfield, its progress marked by broken stalks and the low, guttural sound of its breathing. A sound that was both growl and hiss, a wrongness that set Gideon's teeth on edge. He and Sable fell into a rhythm without speaking, a dance of predator and prey that had been refined over centuries of hunting, except now they were hunting the same thing. The hybrid burst from the cornfield, a hulking mass of twisted flesh, too many teeth and eyes that glowed with an unnatural yellow light. It saw them both and snarled, its body coiling to attack. Sable moved first, a blur of motion that was faster than sight. She was a dark ribbon in the moonlight, her blades flashing as she darted in, slashing at the hybrid's flank. The creature roared, turning its attention to her, its claws raking through the air where she'd been a heartbeat before. Gideon waited, his eyes tracking the hybrid's movements, searching for the opening, the weakness in its unnatural armor. He saw it then, a flicker in the hybrid's movement, a hesitation at the joint where its arm met shoulder. Silver resistance was thinnest where the body bent. He moved in as Sable danced away, her blade having drawn the hybrid's attention. His greatsword was too heavy for the precision needed, so he drew one of his silver daggers. He drove it forward, not with force but with the certainty of a blade finding its mark. The silver sank into the joint and the hybrid screamed, a sound of pure agony that was both human and animal. It staggered, its legs buckling. Sable was on it in an instant, her blades finding its throat. The hybrid thrashed once, twice, then went still. The silence that followed was broken only by their breathing, harsh and ragged in the night air. They stood over the corpse, two killers who had just worked together with deadly efficiency. Gideon noticed something then as he wiped his blade clean. When Sable had moved, she'd positioned herself between the hybrid and him. She'd shielded him. He didn't mention it, neither did she. The unspoken acknowledgement hung between them, heavier than any thanks could have been. The hybrid's body steamed in the cold night air as Sale crouched beside it, her fingers tracing the unnatural ridges of its silver-resistant hide. It was wrong, so fundamentally wrong that it made her stomach turn. This wasn't evolution. This was perversion. A perversion that had already cost her coven 4 vampires, 4 of her kin torn apart by these abominations. 4 of her kin torn apart by these abominations. She looked up as Gideon approached, his greatsword slung over his shoulder, his face grim in the moonlight. They were at a burned-out farmhouse, the wreckage of some long-ago tragedy providing shelter from the wind. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in its own way. They didn't need words to understand what had just happened. They had worked, they had killed, they had survived. "They're getting stronger," Gideon said, his voice rough. Sable nodded, her gaze still on the hybrid's body. "The blood is wrong, 2 species mixed. It's like hearing 2 notes played at once that should never be together." She looked at him then, meeting his eyes. "I can smell them from miles away. The wrongness carries on the wind." Gideon crouched beside her, pulling a small knife from his belt. He tested the hybrid's hide with the edge, his expression grim. "Silver resistance is thinnest where the body bends, the joints, the spine, the neck." He didn't need to say more, they both understood the implications. "My coven has lost 4 vampires to these things," Sable said, the words tasting of ash in her mouth. Gideon's jaw tight. "My guild has lost 6 hunters." The numbers were escalating. Someone was making these things. Someone was creating weapons that threatened both their kinds. They needed to find the source, before it was too late. "We hunt together," Gideon said, his voice leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. Sable studied his face, searching for the trap, the trick. There was none, just cold, hard necessity. "Until we find where they come from," she agreed. Gideon gave her a condition then, his eyes never leaving hers. "If any hybrid gets past us to civilians, I will hold you responsible." It wasn't a threat, it was a term of engagement, a warrior setting the rules. Sable met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "If you ever hesitate with your silver because I'm a vampire, I'll leave you to fight alone." These were the terms of their strange alliance. Not trust, not friendship, but necessity. The understanding that in the face of a common enemy, even ancient hatreds must be set aside. They stood then, the unspoken pact sealed between them. 2 predators, bound by a war that wasn't theirs, fighting an enemy that was a perversion of everything they knew. They moved on, the burned-out farmhouse fading behind them as they followed the hybrid's trail into the night. The rhythm was different now, easier, more fluid. They moved as if they'd hunted together for years, not just one night. Sable's speed drew the hybrid's attention, her blades a whirlwind of deadly grace. Gideon waited, his silver finding the gaps in their armor, the joints where the silver resistance was thinnest. They were efficient, terrifyingly so. And in the quiet moments between hunts, when they sat in silence or shared the cold water from a stream, something else began to stir. Not friendship, not yet, but something that felt like understanding. They talked then, not of strategy or tactics, but of the past. Sable told him about her sister, the war that had taken her, the desperate choice to turn her that had ended in tragedy. Gideon told him about his parents, about the vampire who had killed them, about his mother's dying wish that he protect others from monsters. The hatred wasn't personal, not anymore. It was generational, a legacy of pain that they were both carrying. A legacy of pain that they were both carrying. And in sharing that pain, they began to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow survivors. As night bled into dawn, they found shelter in another abandoned structure, this time a crumbling stone chapel. The sky lightened to a pale, watery blue, and Sable felt the first prickling of sunlight on her skin. It was a familiar pain, a burning reminder of what she was. "Cellar," Gideon said, nodding toward a dark opening in the floor. "It's deep enough." "I'll stand guard." Sable didn't argue. She descended into the cool darkness, the stone walls leaching the last of the night's chill from the air. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes, the exhaustion of the hunt finally catching up with her. Through the floorboards above, she heard the rhythmic scraping of whetstone on silver. Gideon sharpening his sword. The sound was steady, reassuring. It was the sound of a warrior preparing for the next battle. And for the first time in decades, Sable fell asleep without the weight of loneliness pressing down on her. The first time in 2 centuries she slept near someone without wanting to kill them. Sable woke at dusk, the familiar ache of hunger gnawing at her stomach. For a moment she disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings of the stone chapel's cellar confusing her. Then she remembered, Gideon, the hunt, the alliance. She sat up, listening. Through the floorboards she heard his voice, low and urgent. Another one, east, moving fast. She was already moving, her body a blur of motion as she ascended the stairs, her blades in her hands. Gideon stood just outside the chapel, his greatsword drawn, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where the first stars were pricking through the twilight. He didn't look surprised to see her. He'd known she was awake. "It's close," he said, nodding toward a line of trees half a mile away. "Too fast to be natural." Sable nodded, her senses stretching, searching for the wrongness in the air. There, beneath the scent of pine and damp earth, the copper tang of hybrid blood and something else. A trail, not just one, several. "They're moving in a pack," she said, her voice tight, Gideon's jaw tight. "That's new." They moved then, falling back into their deadly dance, the unspoken understanding between them a silent current in the night air. The pack of hybrids was waiting for them in a small clearing, 5 of them, their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. They snarled as the vampires and hunter approached, their bodies coiling, too many teeth bared in anticipation of the kill. "Speed first," Gideon said, his voice low. Sable didn't need to be told. She moved, a dark streak in the moonlight, her blades flashing as she darted among the hybrids, drawing their attention, her movements a blur of deadly grace. The hybrids snarled, turning their attention to her, their claws raking through the air where she'd been a heartbeat before. Gideon waited, his eyes tracking their movements, searching for the openings, the weaknesses in their unnatural armor. He saw it then, the hesitation at the joints, the flicker in their movements that marked the thinnest points of their silver resistance. He moved in as Sable danced away, his greatsword too heavy for precision, so he drew his silver daggers. He drove them forward, not with force, but with the certainty of a blade finding its mark. He drove them forward, not with force, but with the certainty of a blade finding its mark. The silver sank into the joint of the nearest hybrid and it screamed, a sound of pure agony that was both human and animal. It staggered, its legs buckling. Sable was on it in an instant, her blades finding its throat. The hybrid thrashed once, twice, then went still, but there were 4 more, and they were angry. The remaining hybrids turned on Gideon, their movements coordinated now, a pack working together with deadly efficiency. One of them lunged, its claws extended, and Gideon barely managed to parry with his greatsword, the force of the impact driving him back a step. Another hybrid darted in, and he felt claws rake across his shoulder, tearing through his leather armor and drawing blood. He grunted in pain, stumbling back, his silver daggers finding the joint of the attacking hybrid. It screamed, stumbling away, but the damage was done. He was bleeding and the hybrids could smell it. They pressed their advantage, their coordinated attack overwhelming him. He fought back with all his skill, his silver finding its mark, but there were too many. They were wearing him down. Sable saw it then, Gideon bleeding, stumbling, the hybrids closing in. Something in her chest tightened, a feeling that was protectiveness and something else, something she hadn't felt in 2 centuries. She moved then, not as a hunter drawing attention, but as a shield. She threw herself between Gideon and the nearest hybrid, her blades a whirlwind of deadly grace. The hybrid snarled, turning its attention to her, its claws raking through the air where she'd been a heartbeat before. She danced away, her movements a blur, but one of the other hybrids managed to catch her, its claws tearing through her sleeve and drawing blood. She hissed in pain, the smell of her own blood filling the air. Gideon saw it, and something in his eyes shifted. The hunter's discipline wavered, replaced by something else, something that looked like anger. He moved then, not with the cold precision of a hunter, but with the fury of a protector. His greatsword flashed silver, gleaming in the moonlight as he drove it forward into the hybrid that had wounded Sable. The creature screamed, stumbling back, and Gideon pressed his advantage, his movements faster now, more furious. The remaining hybrids hesitated, confused by this shift in the battle. Sable saw her opening. She moved in, her blades finding the throat of the wounded hybrid. It went down, and the remaining hybrids snarled, turning to flee. Gideon moved to pursue, but Sable caught his arm. "Let them go," she said, her voice breathless. "We've done enough damage for one night." Gideon stopped, breathing heavily, his greatsword still in his hand. He looked at Sable, at the tear in her sleeve where the hybrid's claws had drawn blood. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said everything. He'd seen her protect him, she'd seen him fight for her. The rules were changing. The lines were blurring, and in the moonlit clearing with the taste of blood and victory on their lips, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Gideon watched as the remaining hybrids melted back into the shadows, their movements too fast for the human eye to follow. 3 weeks. They'd been hunting together for 3 weeks, and still he couldn't reconcile the vampire before him with the stories he'd been told since childhood. They'd been hunting together for 3 weeks, and still he couldn't reconcile the vampire before him with the stories he'd been told since childhood. She moved with lethal grace, yes, but there was a weariness in her eyes that went beyond mere predator instinct. He'd seen her hesitate when a human child had cried out during the fight, seen her blade swerve at the last moment. Vampires didn't hesitate, not according to the hunter's tales. The northern mountains bit at them even through their layers of clothing. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and wrong. The hybrids, their trail led them higher into terrain where fewer places to hide meant fewer places for the abominations to ambush them. They traveled at night when Sable was at her strongest and rested during the day when Gideon could see and think clearly. He'd learned her rhythms, she didn't sleep like a person. She would go still as death, her breathing so shallow he'd check for a pulse, then snap back to life at dusk with no transition in between. He wondered what that felt like to exist between worlds, neither fully alive nor truly dead. Meanwhile, Sable had learned his. Every morning, regardless of where they were, he would find a quiet spot, face east, and pray. Brief and private, she never intruded. She'd asked once who he prayed to. He'd just shaken his head, said, "Someone who understands duty." That was all. The pendant he always wore, a small silver circle on a thin chain, wasn't a weapon. It was too small for that, but he touched it constantly, his thumb rubbing over its surface when he thought she wasn't looking. "North," Sable said, her voice cutting through the night air. She pointed toward a jagged peak where the moonlight caught on something metallic. "The trail gets stronger, we're close." Gideon nodded, hefting his greatsword. The weight was familiar, comforting. The silver-forged blade was already showing signs of stress, a spiderweb of cracks near the hilt from where it had met hybrid hide. He had 3 throwing knives left and a sword that might not survive another direct hit against one of those silver-resistant monsters. They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the loose scree underfoot. The wind howled around them, carrying the scent of pine and rain and something else, the hybrids. Wrong, like blood mixed with ozone and decay. Then the attack came. Not 1 but 2 hybrids dropping from above, their forms twisting midair to land silently on either side of them. No words, no time to react beyond instinct. Sable was already moving, a blur of black leather and silver blades, engaging the first hybrid with a flurry of strikes that kept it spinning, never allowing it to fully face her. Her curved daggers flashed in the moonlight, each strike finding a vulnerable point, shoulder, thigh, ribs, but never the kill zone. She was buying time, drawing its attention. Gideon didn't hesitate. He flowed toward the second hybrid, his greatsword a silver arc in the darkness. He'd learned from Sable that these things had a weakness at the joints where the silver-resistant hide stretched thin. He targeted the neck joint, driving the blade home with a grunt of effort. The hybrid staggered, its roar turning into a gurgle as silver seared through flesh and muscle. It collapsed, twitching. The first hybrid roared in fury, turning from Sable to face the new threat. Big mistake. Big mistake. Sable's blade opened its belly from hip to ribcage in a single fluid motion. Black ichor-like blood sprayed across the rocks. Before the dying hybrid could even fall, Gideon was there, his sword descending in a vertical strike that severed the thing's spine with a sickening crunch. 15 seconds, maybe less. They stood back to back, breathing heavily, the stench of hybrid blood filling the air. Gideon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a short, sharp sound almost like a laugh. Almost. He turned to look at Sable, expecting the usual cold detachment, the vampire mask, but it wasn't there. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw something he'd never seen on a vampire's face: respect. It was fleeting, gone in the next blink, but it had been there, and that changed everything. Sable cleaned her blades methodically, wiping away the hybrid's black blood with a scrap of cloth. The cold mountain air bit at her exposed skin, but she barely felt it. Her mind was elsewhere, on the way Gideon had moved tonight, like he'd been fighting by her side for years, not weeks. His timing was perfect, his strikes precise. He'd learned her rhythms and she'd learned his. They were a deadly dance, predator and hunter, and somehow it worked. Your pendant, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. She nodded toward the silver circle that rested against his chest, visible above the collar of his shirt. Gideon's hand went to it automatically, his fingers closing around the small circle. My mother gave it to me, he said, his voice rough, the night she died. Sable waited. He didn't elaborate right away, just stared at the mountains in the distance. She told me to protect people from monsters, he finally said, his voice low. She didn't say which kind. He looked at her then, his eyes pale in the moonlight, just that some monsters wear pretty faces and some don't. Sable was quiet for a long time, the wind whistling around them. I became a vampire to save my sister, she said, the words feeling foreign even after 2 centuries. She was dying of a plague. A vampire offered to turn her. I begged him to turn me instead. I thought vampire blood would heal her, that I could give it to her. She paused, the memory as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. It didn't work. The turning process, it's not gentle, it destroys what was human first. By the time it was done, she was already gone. I killed my sister to save her, and I've been a predator for 2 centuries carrying the weight of that choice. Gideon didn't say, I'm sorry, or that must be hard. He just nodded, his hand still resting on the silver pendant. My mother told me to protect people from monsters, he repeated as if reminding himself. She didn't say which kind. Sable looked at him, really looked at him. Not as a hunter, not as a vampire, but as a man who had lost everything too. The wall between them, the instinctive hatred that had defined their kind for 1,000 years, cracked, just a little, enough to see through. They were both just people who had lost their families to the dark and decided to fight back instead of being consumed by grief. We should keep moving, Gideon said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The trail's getting stronger. Sable nodded, sheathing her blades. They traveled in silence after that, but it was different. The silence wasn't filled with tension, but with something else, understanding, shared pain. The trail ended abruptly at a narrow mountain pass that led downward into darkness. The air grew thick with the wrong scent of hybrids, metallic and foul, and there were dozens of them pacing in patterns before a reinforced metal door set into the rock face. This was the source, the breeding ground, the horror. Sable counted quickly, her eyes sharp in the moonlight. At least 30 hybrids, ranging in size and deformity. Some walked on 2 legs, others on 4, some had too many eyes, others too many teeth. They moved in synchronized patterns, a grotesque dance. Gideon checked his remaining weapons, 3 throwing knives and a greatsword that was already cracked along the length. Not enough, not nearly enough. They crouched in the darkness above the facility entrance, hidden by rocks and shadows, watching the hybrids circle below. The wind carried their guttural sounds, growls mixed with hisses, clicks and whistles that defied identification. When I move, you count to 3, Sable whispered, her voice barely audible. Then you don't stop until everything down there is dead. Gideon nodded, his hand tightening on the hilt of his greatsword. He didn't ask if she was ready. He didn't need to, he could see it in her eyes, the same determination he felt in his own soul. They had come this far through blood and moonlight, and they would see it through to the end. 1, Sable whispered, her body coiled like a spring. Gideon took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. And then they moved. The moon hung heavy and silver above the mountain laboratory, a cruel spotlight on the 30-plus hybrids patrolling below. Gideon counted them again, his fingers tracing the cracks in the leather-wrapped hilt of his greatsword. 32. Maybe 33 if the one limping near the east entrance counted as a full threat. 2 against 33. The numbers didn't lie, and they didn't lie to him either. They were going to die tomorrow, or tonight. Depending on how you counted time when you were about to storm a vampire-werewolf hybrid research facility built into the side of a mountain. He ran a whetstone along the blade, the rasp loud in the quiet night. The greatsword had served him well, but the last hybrid had gotten lucky, chipping the steel near the guard. It would have to do. There was no time for a proper forge, not with the hybrids below growing more restless with each passing hour. His life had become a series of impossible odds and blood-soaked nights. Once he'd been a boy who dreamed of becoming a blacksmith, following in his father's footsteps. Now his only companion was the weight of silver in his hands and the ghosts of his parents at his back. They'd been killed by a vampire, a creature of the night who had laughed as it drained them dry. He'd been 10 years old, hidden in the root cellar, the scent of his mother's blood thick in his nose. That night had forged him into what he was now, a werewolf-hunter with a death wish and a sword that never left his side. He glanced at Sable, sitting motionless beside him, her dual blades gleaming in the moonlight. She was a creature of contradictions, ancient yet ageless, deadly yet burdened by a past he only knew fragments of. She was a creature of contradictions, ancient yet ageless, deadly yet burdened by a past he only knew fragments of. She told him why she became a vampire to save her dying sister and how her sister hadn't survived the transition. He told her about his parents. They shared pain like they shared combat rhythms efficiently without unnecessary words. "Something's wrong," Sable said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "The patrol patterns, they're too regular, like they're being directed." Gideon nodded, his eyes scanning the hybrids below, or baited. Before he could finish the thought, a hybrid broke from the formation, moving purposefully toward their ridge, not toward them exactly, but close enough to be a threat. Too close. "They're checking the perimeter," Gideon said, already rising to his feet. "We need to move." "No," Sable said, her hand resting on his arm. "Too late for that, we handle it, here, now, no alarms." She was already moving before the words fully left her mouth. A blur of shadow and moonlight, she dropped from their perch, landing silently in the scrub below. Gideon followed, his movements economical but not as silent as hers. The hybrid turned, its nostrils flaring, sensing them too late. Sable was on it before it could raise the alarm. One blade flashed across its throat, the other pinning its clawed hand to the rocky ground. But the hybrid was stronger than it looked. With a guttural roar, it threw her aside like a rag doll. Sable hit the ground rolling, coming up in a crouch, blades ready. Gideon was already moving. The hybrid turned toward him and he drove a silver knife into the joint of its neck. The creature went rigid, then collapsed. They stood over it for a moment, catching their breath, the silence pressing in around them. Together, they dragged the body into the shadows of an overhang. As their hands brushed, pulling the corpse into deeper shadow, neither pulled away immediately. The contact was brief, electric, a spark in the darkness that had nothing to do with combat. Gideon felt it all the way up his arm, a warmth that had nothing to do with exertion. Sable felt the adrenaline still singing in her veins, a familiar aftertune to battle. She needed to move, to run, to burn off the energy before it curdled into something else. Without a word, she took off along the ridge, her vampiric speed blurring the landscape into streaks of shadow and silver moon. She wasn't hunting, not really, just running. When she returned, Gideon was watching her, his silhouette sharp against the night sky. She sat beside him, breathing hard, though she didn't need to breathe. The motion was habitual, a relic of the girl she'd once been. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the wind whistling through the rocks and the distant howl of a hybrid below. "Do you remember what food tasted like?" Gideon asked suddenly, his voice soft in the night. Sable froze. She hadn't thought about food in 200 years, not really. She remembered hunger, but not the taste of things. "Bread," she said, surprising herself. I think bread was warm and it had a crust that crackled." Gideon nodded slowly. "My mother used to make bread, the smell would fill the house." "I remember my sister eating honey," Sable said, the memory hitting her like a physical blow. "The way she closed her eyes when she tasted it, like it was the most wonderful thing in the world." Like it was the most wonderful thing in the world. I remember wanting to taste what she tasted. She'd never told anyone that, not in all the years since. Gideon reached into his pack and pulled out a small jar. "I've been carrying this," he said, holding it out to her, "for weeks, I don't know why." Sable looked at the jar like it was a bomb, honey, the thing she'd wanted to taste when her sister's face lit up with pleasure. She took it, her fingers brushing his again. This time she didn't pull away, she dipped one finger into the golden liquid and brought it to her lips. The sweetness flooded her mouth, overwhelming. Her eyes closed. For one perfect moment she wasn't a vampire warrior. She was a girl whose sister loved honey, who wanted to understand what made her sister's face glow like that. When she opened her eyes, Gideon was watching her with an expression she'd never seen from a human, not fear, not hatred, not even pity, tenderness. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once. "I remember now," she whispered, the honey thick on her tongue. "Bread with honey, it was warm." Gideon smiled, a small, genuine thing that reached his eyes. "My mother used to make that for me when I was sick." In that moment, something shifted between them. The careful distance they maintained, the barrier of hunter and prey, vampire and human, it thinned, just a little. "Three hybrids," Gideon said, his voice suddenly sharp, all tenderness gone, emerging from the facility, heading east toward the villages. Sable's head snapped up, her vampire senses confirming his words. The hybrids were moving fast, already halfway to the forest that bordered the human settlements. "They're trying to draw us out," she said, standing up, "or create a diversion." "Either way," Gideon said, rising beside her, his hand closing around the hilt of his greatsword, "we can't let them reach civilians." They looked at each other, no words needed. The tenderness vanished, replaced by the family Chinese letter of hunters. They moved as one, dropping from the ridge into the forest below, Sable a blur of shadow, Gideon a streak of silver, and the hybrids below never knowing what was about to hit them. The hybrid guards didn't stand a chance. Sable was a blur of motion, twin curved blades flashing in the dim light of the laboratory entrance. She moved faster than sight, her vampire speed a weapon in itself. The first hybrid, a hulking thing with too many joints and mismatched eyes, barely registered her presence before its head went flying, spraying thick, dark blood across the concrete floor. "Two," Gideon counted, his voice steady despite the chaos. His greatsword was a blur of silver, a wall of deadly steel. He drove through the hybrids like a force of nature, each swing precise and brutal. A hybrid lunged at him with claws that gleamed like blackened silver. Gideon sidestepped, the creature's claws tearing through his coat but missing his flesh. He countered with a vicious upward thrust, his silver-forged blade finding the gap at the hybrid's shoulder joint where flesh met unnatural sinew. The creature screamed, a sound that was both growl and hiss before collapsing. "Three," Sable called out, already moving. She spun, her blades a deadly dance. Another hybrid, this one with the lean frame of a vampire but the snarling muzzle of a werewolf, charged her. Sable dropped low, sliding between its legs. As she came up, she sliced through the back of its knees. The hybrid collapsed, howling in pain. She didn't give it a chance to recover. A quick, precise cut across the throat silenced it forever. Gideon was a whirlwind of destruction. Two hybrids converged on him from opposite sides. He planted his feet, braced himself, and swung his greatsword in a wide arc. The blade caught both creatures in the midsection, where their bodies merged at an unnatural angle. The silver blade burned through their hybrid hides and they fell in a heap, twitching as their unnatural bodies failed them. Six, Gideon counted, breathing heavily but not slowing. His coat was torn, blood staining the fabric, his and theirs. A deep gash ran across his forearm, but he barely seemed to notice. "Seven," Sable replied, her voice calm. She wiped blood from one of her blades with a piece of cloth from her belt. The hybrid guards were down. The entrance was clear, but the stench of death and wrongness hung heavy in the air. "Now we see what Corvin has been hiding." They descended into the laboratory, the air growing thick with the scent of blood and chemicals. Sable's heightened senses were overwhelmed. The smell hit her first, a cocktail of old blood, many different species and chemicals that burned even her vampire senses. Her stomach twisted not with hunger but with revulsion. This was an abattoir, a place where life was twisted into something unnatural. Then she saw the cages, rows of them lining the walls. Some contained failed hybrid experiments, things that were half-formed, still alive, whimpering incoherently. Others held what was left of werewolves and vampires who hadn't survived the transformation. Their bodies were twisted, broken, some barely recognizable as their former selves. Sable had seen 2 centuries of violence, but this was different. This was perversion. She stopped, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade, and took a breath she didn't need. The weight of what she was seeing settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Gideon moved ahead, his greatsword held ready. He found the operating room first, surgical tables with restraints still stained with blood. Jars of hybrid serum lined the shelves, dark liquid that seemed to move on its own, swirling with unnatural energy. Notes were scattered across a desk, written in a precise, calm hand that contrasted sharply with the horrors surrounding them. Subject 47, vampire female, 120 years, failed fusion at hour 6, dispose. Subject 52, werewolf male, alpha strain, rejected the transformation, terminated. Subject 61, successful hybridization, enhanced strength and speed, silver resistance confirmed, ready for testing. Gideon's hands were shaking, not with fear but with a cold, burning fury that matched the heat of his anger. He had hunted monsters his entire life, but this was something else entirely. This was creation without compassion, science without morality. The systematic cruelty of it all was almost more than he could bear. Sable found the living captives next. 4 vampires and 3 werewolves in reinforced cells, all drugged and weak but still alive. They looked up as she approached, their eyes wide with fear and hope. One of the vampires, a young man with dark hair and haunted eyes, recognized her, his face lit with a flicker of hope. "Sable," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Cashin from the coven, you came." Sable's control snapped. "You came." Sable's control snapped. The sight of one of her own held captive in this hellhole was too much. Her vampire rage surged, hot and violent. She wanted to tear the lab apart, to find the man responsible and make him pay for every moment of suffering. Her claws extended, her eyes burning with crimson light. Gideon saw the change in her. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. It was the first time he had ever touched her voluntarily, his warm fingers closing around her cold flesh. The contrast sent a jolt through both of them, a spark in the darkness. Sable looked at him, her rage warring with something else, something that recognized the wisdom in his restraint. "Free them first," Gideon said, his voice low and hard. "Revenge after." Sable stared into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that this was a trick. There was none, only determination and a cold clarity that mirrored her own. She nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. Together. They worked fast, Gideon using his strength to pry open the reinforced cells while Sable stood guard, her blades ready. The freed captives were weak, disoriented, but they moved with a desperate urgency. Cashin leaned heavily on Sable as he stumbled out of his cell, his body still trembling from the drugs. "Thorn needs help," he said, nodding toward a massive werewolf who was struggling to stand. "They gave him too much of the serum, it's still in his system." Sable helped Cashin over to the werewolf, who was indeed enormous, easily 7 feet tall with muscles that strained against his skin. He was growling, half-conscious, his body rejecting the transformation. A vampire woman named Elise moved to help, her movements still graceful despite her weakness. "We need to move," Gideon said, scanning the room. "There are more hybrids somewhere, this place is too quiet." As if on cue, an alarm blared to life, red lights flashing throughout the laboratory, heavy footsteps echoed from deeper chambers. Hybrids were coming, more than guards, these were experiments released to contain the breach. "Go!" Sable yelled, pushing the freed captives toward the exit. "We'll hold them off." The werewolves and vampires hesitated, centuries of instinct warring with their current situation. Thorn, the massive werewolf, seemed to shake off some of the drug's effects. He picked up a fallen hybrid's arm bone, its claws still attached, and used it as a club. Elise, the vampire, moved with surprising speed, dragging a fallen werewolf who couldn't walk on his own. Vampires and werewolves fighting side by side. Sable watched in awe as they worked together, protecting each other, moving as one unit. It was the first time in 1,000 years that such a thing had happened, and it was happening in this hellhole of a laboratory. Gideon and Sable fought back to back, a deadly dance of silver and steel. Hybrids poured into the room, their bodies twisted and wrong. Sable moved like smoke, her blades finding the weak points in their anatomy. Gideon was a fortress, his greatsword carving through the hybrids with brutal efficiency. They fought as one, their movements synchronized by instinct and trust. The freed captives limped toward the exit, the wounded helping the weaker. Thorn swung his bone club with surprising force, crushing a hybrid's skull. Elise used her speed to pull another werewolf out of the path of a charging hybrid. It was chaos, but it was working. It was chaos, but it was working. They were escaping. Sable drove her blade through the last hybrid, blocking their path, its blood spraying across her face. She didn't flinch. Now. They burst out into the mountain air, gasping as the cold night air hit their faces. Dawn was coming, a pale light on the eastern horizon. The vampires among them began to panic, their skin already tingling with the coming sunlight. "Gideon, we need cover," Sable called out, her voice urgent. Gideon pointed to a cave system he'd spotted on their approach. "There, move." They ran, the freed captives stumbling but pushing forward. The hybrids were regrouping, their unnatural howls echoing behind them. Sable stayed back, fighting off the stragglers, buying time for the others. She was the last one into the cave, her skin already smoking from the pre-dawn light. Gideon grabbed her collar and pulled her in just as the sun crested the mountains, bathing the entrance in blinding light. The cave went dark as their eyes adjusted. The freed captives collapsed in exhaustion, their bodies trembling from the drugs and the exertion. Sable leaned against the cave wall, her chest heaving, the taste of hybrid blood still in her mouth. Gideon stood watch at the entrance, his greatsword held ready, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond. Somewhere behind them, the laboratory was still churning out hybrids, and somewhere in that lab was the man responsible, Corvin. He was still out there, and he wasn't done. Gideon turned from the entrance, his face illuminated by the faint light filtering into the cave. He looked at the freed captives, their faces etched with pain and fear. His voice was steady, cutting through the silence. "Who did this to you?" Cashin, barely conscious, lifted his head. His voice was weak but clear. "Corvin, his name is Corvin, and he's not done." Gideon's jaw tightened. He had faced monsters his entire life, but this was different. This was a human who had twisted nature itself into something abominable, and Sable was looking at him, her eyes burning with a mixture of determination and something else, something that mirrored his own resolve. They had faced the hybrids, they had faced the laboratory, but they hadn't faced Corvin yet, and they would, together. The last of the freed captives disappeared into the cave system, Thorn's form melting into the shadows as he took watch. Gideon wiped blood from his greatsword's silver edge, the metallic tang sharp in his mouth. The air was thick with the scent of fear, blood, and pine, nature's attempt to reclaim what humans had defiled. Sable stood beside him, her dual blades humming with contained energy, her eyes scanning the treeline where the moon struggled through the clouds. "He's still in there," Gideon said, his voice low. "Corvin, and he's not done." Sable's gaze met his, the silver flecks in her eyes catching the moonlight. "We can't let him continue, not just for revenge, for everyone he's already taken." They moved as one, predators of different breeds hunting the same prey. The lab entrance was re-guarded, but fewer hybrids than before. Corvin was spreading his poison, sending his abominations outward to hunt, to spread. Sable stopped suddenly, her head tilting. "There's another way, a ventilation shaft. I smelled it when we first came, chemicals and something else. Something else, decay." She led him not to the front entrance but to the side of the building, where a metal grate was partially concealed by overgrown vines. Together they tore it free, revealing a dark shaft that descended into the earth. Gideon went first, his silver-lined boots finding purchase on the metal rungs, his greatsword held ready. Sable followed, her movements silent as falling snow, her form barely registering in the limited light. They dropped into the lower levels of the lab, landing in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and something foul, like rotting meat mixed with chemicals. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows. Gideon's hand tightened on his sword's hilt as they moved forward, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Sable's senses expanded in the confined space. She could smell the blood of dozens, vampires, werewolves, humans, all mixed together in a nauseating cocktail. The air vibrated with a wrongness that made her fangs ache. This was where Corvin performed his atrocities, where he twisted nature into something profane. They found a heavy metal door slightly ajar. Sable pushed it open, revealing a study that was both meticulous and chaotic. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes and jars containing things, specimens in formaldehyde, bones arranged in impossible patterns, and on the largest wall dozens of diagrams comparing vampire physiology to werewolf anatomy. Sable's eyes traced the notes scrawled in the margins, calculations, observations, a cold, clinical obsession. She moved to a large oak desk, its surface cluttered with papers and strange instruments. One leather-bound book lay open, its pages filled in a precise, looping hand. Sable began to read, her breath catching in her throat. Day 1, subject shows promise. Vampire strength but fragile, silver resistance minimal, werewolf resilience but mindless rage, neither is the perfect soldier. Day 47, the breakthrough. By combining the cellular structures, I can create something new, something that takes the best of both, discards the weaknesses. Day 112, the first hybrid. It attacks everything including me, uncontrollable, a failure but a step in the right direction. The kingdoms are interested. War between vampires and werewolves is profitable. It keeps them distracted while I perfect my creation. Sable's knuckles whitened around the journal's pages. This wasn't just madness, it was manipulation on a grand scale. Corvin had been engineering attacks, feeding the ancient war between their species, all while building his army in secret. He saw them not as living beings but as components in his grand design. Gideon moved to a locked cabinet, his silver knife sliding between the door and frame with practiced ease. Inside were vials of glowing liquid, some red, some black, and one that shimmered with an unnatural light. He picked up the shimmering one. "It's the formula," he said, his voice tight, "for the hybrids." "And this," Sable said, pointing to a smaller vial filled with clear liquid, "must be the antidote, the reversal formula." Gideon took both vials, securing them in a pouch at his waist. "This changes everything. We can save them, the hybrids that are still out there." "First, we end him," Sable said, her voice cold as grave dirt. Before they could move, the door to the study swung open. Corvin stood there, not the cackling madman they might have expected, but a man in a tailored leather coat, his posture straight, his movements economical. But his eyes were wrong. Gold with flecks of red that seemed to shift and move like living things. He had used the perfected serum on himself. He was a hybrid but in control, or so he believed. "You should have stayed with the others," Corvin said, his voice smooth as silk. "They would have made fine specimens." Gideon raised his greatsword. "We're here to stop you." Corvin smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "You can't stop what's already begun. The serum is out. Kingdoms have bought my hybrids. The old world is ending. A new one is rising, and I am its architect." He moved then, not with the lurching gait of the hybrids, but with Sable's unnatural speed. Before Gideon could react, Corvin was behind him, his fist striking the greatsword and shattering a silver edge. The force sent vibrations up Gideon's arms. "He's faster than you," Sable said, her blades already in motion, a silver arc aimed at Corvin's neck. Corvin dodged, his movements too fluid, too precise. "And stronger than you," he countered, backhanding Sable hard enough to send her crashing into a bookshelf. Glass and paper rained down around her. They were outmatched. Individually they stood no chance. But together, Gideon saw it in Sable's eyes as she rose from the debris, her bloodlust mixing with something else, calculation. "He can't hit what he can't catch," she said, her voice a low growl. Gideon understood. He would be the anvil, she the hammer. He took a defensive stance, his remaining silver edge gleaming. "The joints, even he has thin points." Corvin advanced, a predator toying with prey. "You think you can defeat perfection?" His voice was a low rumble, layered with something inhuman. Sable moved, a blur of black leather and silver steel. She attacked not to kill but to redirect, to force Corvin into motion. He met her blade for blade, his strength staggering her, but his speed couldn't match hers. She was a phantom, striking and retreating, never staying in one place long enough for him to land a solid blow. Gideon waited, his eyes scanning Corvin's form. He saw it, the slight hesitation at the shoulder, the unnatural bend in the knee. He threw a throwing knife not to kill but to test. The silver blade struck Corvin's elbow, drawing a line of black blood that smoked in the air. Corvin roared, a sound that was both growl and scream, and turned his full attention to Gideon. "You think a little silver can stop me?" He moved like a freight train, his fist connecting with Gideon's chest. The silver-lined armor cracked, and Gideon felt ribs give way. Air fled his lungs as he was thrown against the far wall, his vision blurring. Sable screamed his name, her blades a frenzy of motion, but Corvin backhanded her aside. She crashed into a table, breaking it in two. The vials of serum went flying, shattering against the floor. The air filled with the scent of chemicals and ozone. Corvin advanced on Gideon, who struggled to rise, his greatsword too heavy, his body screaming in protest. Your little alliance ends here, the vampire and the hunter, both of you destroyed by what you created. He raised a hand, claws extending, ready to deliver the final blow. Gideon closed his eyes, accepting his fate, but it didn't come. Instead, he felt a presence beside him, a cold hand on his wrist, and then agony. Sable's fangs sank into his wrist, not to kill, but to take. The pain was blinding, electric, and then something else, her essence flowing into him, cold and ancient. It was the most intimate violation he had ever experienced, yet in the same instant he felt her take something of his in return, his iron resilience, his unyielding will. The pain subsided, replaced by a surge of power that made his wounds knit, made his muscles sing. His eyes snapped open, glowing with an unnatural amber light. He moved not as a hunter, but as something more, something faster. He caught Corvin's arm mid-strike, his grip like iron. Together they were a storm. Sable was faster than Corvin now, her movements a blur that even his enhanced eyes could barely track. Gideon moved with her, his silver finding the joints Corvin couldn't defend. They drove him back through the lab, equipment shattering, serum jars exploding in showers of glowing liquid. Corvin roared, his human facade cracking, his hybrid nature surging to the surface. He became just another hybrid, strong, fast, but mindless in his rage, and they knew exactly how to kill hybrids. Sable's blade found its mark, sliding between his ribs. Gideon followed through, his silver greatsword piercing Corvin's neck. The hybrid king fell, his body convulsing, his golden eyes fading to black. The lab was burning around them, flames licking at the walls, consuming Corvin's notes and diagrams, his grand design reduced to ash. Gideon grabbed Sable's hand, the vials of antidote secure in his pouch. We have to go. They ran, the heat at their backs, the screams of the dying building behind them. They didn't look back. They ran until they emerged into the cool night air, the moon rising above the tree line, bathing them in silver light. They stopped, chests heaving, blood and sweat mingling on their skin. Gideon looked at Sable, really looked at her. Her wrist was bleeding where his claws had caught her, her eyes still glowing with amber flecks. He touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. You saved me, he said, the words thick with emotion. You gave me strength, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. It was the only way. They stood there under the moon, two enemies who had become something more. They had faced the darkness together and emerged not unscathed but alive. And they had the antidote, hope for all the hybrids Corvin had created. The world was changing. But for the first time in centuries, Sable felt it might be changing for the better. And Gideon knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would face whatever came next, as long as she was by his side. The fire behind them was a hungry beast, consuming the evidence of Corvin's atrocities, but the scent of burning flesh and chemicals clung to Sable's nostrils, mixing with the damp earth smell of the cave entrance. Gideon pulled her forward, his grip firm on her arm as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of orange and pink. Her skin tightened, a familiar burning sensation spreading across her flesh as the light threatened to consume her. She needed darkness, needed the cool earth to absorb the heat radiating from her body. End! Gideon commanded, his voice rough but not unkind. He propelled her into the mouth of the cave, the sudden coolness a balm on her burning skin. She stumbled slightly, disoriented from the blood loss and the lingering effects of the serum transfer. He steadied her, his hand lingering on her elbow for a moment longer than necessary. Inside the cave, the air was thick with the scent of blood and fear. Dozens of freed captives huddled in the dim light, their faces gaunt, their movements weak. Lise, a vampire with dark circles under her eyes and hands that moved with practiced efficiency, tended to a werewolf's torn shoulder with torn strips of cloth. Thorn, a massive werewolf whose presence filled the cave despite his injuries, stood guard at the entrance, his silhouette a stark silhouette against the fading night. How many? Sable asked, her voice raspy. 27, Elise replied without looking up. 7 vampires, 20 werewolves. We lost 3 during the escape, 2 far gone. Sable nodded, her gaze sweeping over the wounded survivors. Some she recognized, faces from her coven, from patrols she'd led. Others were strangers, but they were all her people now in a way they hadn't been before. Gideon knelt, pulling a small leather pouch from his belt. He poured a handful of dark powder onto a flat stone, then added a few drops of liquid from a vial. The mixture began to bubble, releasing a faint metallic scent. "What is that?" Thorn growled, his eyes fixed on Gideon. "The antidote," Gideon said, his fingers moving with precision as he mixed the components. "Or at least the formula. It needs to be brewed properly with specific ingredients." Elise finally looked up, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "I know some alchemy. The terms, they're familiar. I can help brew it." Sable joined them, kneeling beside Gideon. She watched as he sketched symbols in the powder with a piece of charcoal. "It only works on recent transformations," he said, his voice flat. "The ones Corvin turned in the last few weeks, the ones where the fusion isn't complete." The cave went silent. The only sounds were the crackling of the small fire Gideon had started and the ragged breathing of the wounded. Everyone understood what he was saying. Some of the hybrids hunting them in the wild, some of the ones they had already killed, had been people they knew. Vampires from neighboring covens, werewolves from other packs. "We'll have to hunt them down," Sable said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The ones that can be saved, and the ones that can't." She let the sentence hang, unfinished but complete in its implication. "We'll do what must be done," Gideon said, meeting her gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a grim acceptance. "Together." The week that followed was a blur of brewing, hunting, and burying the dead. They worked in shifts, Elise and a few other vampires brewing the antidote in batches while Sable and Gideon hunted the remaining hybrids. They found them in abandoned buildings, in the woods, in the sewers beneath the city. Some they caught and cured: a young werewolf who transformed back with a gasp, confused and grateful; an elderly vampire who wept with relief as the silver in his veins receded. Others they had to kill. Those were the hardest. The ones who had been transformed too long ago, whose bodies had permanently fused into something monstrous yet undeniably familiar. The ones who had been transformed too long ago, whose bodies had permanently fused into something monstrous yet undeniably familiar. Sable put down a hybrid that had once been a vampire from a neighboring coven, a male named Silas who had always been kind to her during their rare meetings. She held him down as he snarled and twisted, his face a grotesque mask of fangs and fur, while Gideon drove silver through the joint of his neck. The hybrid went still. Sable didn't let go for a long time, her fingers tangled in the matted fur that had once been Silas's dark hair. "He's at peace now," Gideon said quietly, standing over them, "or as close as he can be." "He should have had more time," Sable whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He deserved more time." "He did," Gideon agreed, "and we gave him the mercy he couldn't give himself." The hybrid threat was contained, but the political situation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Lady Vera arrived 2 days later, her presence a wave of cold authority that made the cave temperature drop. She was flanked by 5 ancient vampires, their faces masks of aristocratic fury, their eyes burning with a cold light that had nothing to do with their supernatural nature. The next morning, the werewolf Alpha Grayson arrived with his pack. 7 massive werewolves, their fur matted with blood and dirt, their eyes scanning the area with predatory suspicion. They refused to enter the cave, and the vampires refused to step foot outside. The meeting was to take place in the clearing between the cave mouth and the tree line, a neutral ground that felt anything but. Sable stood between the two groups, Gideon at her side. She could feel the tension radiating from both sides, a palpable force that made the air vibrate. Vera's gaze was sharp, assessing, lingering on Gideon with undisguised contempt. "This human was creating hybrids from our people," Vera said, her voice like ice. "The werewolves' territory borders the lab. Why didn't you notice?" Grayson, a massive gray-furred werewolf whose scars told stories of 100 battles, stepped forward. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in Sable's chest. "Your vampires move through our forests at night. We assumed the disappearances were your doing, that you were creating new weapons." Centuries of accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sable had heard it all before: endless cycles of violence and retribution, each side blaming the other for the sins of the past. She was tired of it, tired of the bloodshed, the hatred, the pointless war. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Both Vera and Grayson turned to look at her, surprise flickering in their eyes. Both of us lost people to Corvin. Both of us fought beside each other to stop him. If you want to keep fighting, do it without us. Clearing fell silent. Sable could feel Gideon's gaze on her, but she kept her eyes locked on the two leaders, challenging them to continue their petty squabbling when there were more important things at stake. Gideon stepped forward then, pulling a small journal from his pack. He held it up, the leather cover worn but intact. Corvin's journal, he said. The formula for the hybrids, sales records showing human kingdoms buying them. The threat wasn't each other, it was someone profiting from our war. He tossed the journal into the center of the clearing. It was someone profiting from our war. He tossed the journal into the center of the clearing. It landed with a soft thud, a small book containing the proof of everything they had endured. Vera's eyes narrowed as she stared at it, then at Grayson. The werewolf alpha let out a low growl, but it was one of frustration, not aggression. The treaty that followed was not easy. It was not warm. It was born of necessity rather than trust, a fragile ceasefire in a war that had raged for 1,000 years. There would be shared patrols of the border territories, exchange of intelligence about hybrid sightings, and a formal acknowledgement that both species had been victims of Corvin's experiments. And most importantly, there would be ambassadors, one vampire, one hunter, Sable and Gideon. The meeting concluded with tense nods and promises to send messengers with the formal treaty documents. The vampires retreated into the cave, the werewolves melted back into the forest, leaving Sable and Gideon alone in the clearing. The moon was full, casting silver light over the grass and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Gideon reached into his shirt, pulling out a silver pendant on a leather cord. It caught the moonlight, gleaming like a star fallen to earth. Sable looked at it, then at him. "Your mother would be proud," she said softly. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "She'd tell me I took too long." He paused, the silence stretching between them, filled only by the sounds of the night. "She'd also tell me not to let you walk away." Sable didn't move. She stood there in the moonlight, her red eyes fixed on his face, searching for something she couldn't name but desperately needed to see. And she found it, not acceptance, not forgiveness, but something better, understanding. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady. Gideon closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. His thumb brushed against her skin, a touch that sent electricity through her veins. She leaned into it, closing her eyes for a moment, savoring the contact. It was dangerous, this thing between them, a predator and a hunter, enemies by nature drawn together by circumstance. But it was real, it was theirs. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both question and answer. She responded immediately, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. There was no gentleness in this kiss, only the raw, desperate need of 2 people who had stared into the abyss and found each other waiting on the other side. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. The moonlight bathed them in silver, her red eyes glowing in the darkness, his silver pendant a stark contrast against his skin. Neither one was afraid of the other anymore. The war between their kinds was far from over, but in this moment, in this clearing, under the watchful eye of the moon, they had found their own peace, and that was enough, for now. The moonlight seemed to hold its breath as the last of the shadows retreated, carrying Lady Vera and Grayson with them. The clearing stood empty, a silent witness to the impossible. 200 years of walking this earth, and Sable had just watched vampires and werewolves sign a treaty. 200 years of walking this earth, and Sable had just watched vampires and werewolves sign a treaty. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a physical thing, heavier than any coffin lid, more substantial than any stone wall she'd hidden behind during the wars. She moved automatically, her body knowing where to go even as her mind reeled and sat on a fallen log. The wood was rough against her palms, real and solid in a world that suddenly felt insubstantial. Gideon settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. The contact sent a current through her, familiar now but still jarring. For so long, touch had meant death for him at her hands, for her at his. Now it meant something else, something she didn't have a name for. Neither spoke. What was there to say? Centuries of war didn't end with a handshake and a few words. It ended in silence, in the quiet aftermath of something that should have been impossible. They were both exhausted, not from the physical strain of negotiations, but from the emotional weight of what they'd done. They had stood between their peoples and forced them to see reason. My mother would have called this a miracle, Gideon said finally, his voice rough in the stillness. Sable turned her head slightly, studying his profile in the moonlight. Do you believe in miracles? He let out a short, humorless laugh. I believe you bit me and I didn't die. The words hung between them, dark and dangerous, and for the first time almost light. The first time either of them had joked about the blood sharing, about the moment that had bound them together in ways they still didn't understand. A corner of Sable's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost. What comes next? She asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. We're ambassadors now, Gideon said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. We'll need to be in both territories, mediating, translating, navigating 1,000 years of prejudice. Sable sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It's overwhelming. I've spent my whole life fighting monsters, Gideon said, his voice low. Now I'm supposed to talk to them. You've been talking to one for weeks, Sable countered. You seem fine. He turned to look at her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the clearing ahead. You're not a monster. The moon was setting now, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple that bled into the darkness. Sable felt the coming dawn like a physical pull, a magnetic force she couldn't resist. She would need shelter, she wouldn't ask for it. Gideon knew that. He stood, offering his hand without a word. Sable stared at it, palm calloused, fingers strong, the same hand that held Silver that had killed her kind for years. The same hand that had held her face when he kissed her. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and he pulled her to her feet. He led her through the trees to a cave he'd spotted earlier during their scouting, rough-hewn stone, opening to a dark maw that smelled of damp earth and time. The same type of cave they'd sheltered in during their hunt for the hybrids. But this time there was no enemy outside, just the dawn coming, creeping across the sky like a thief. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Sable could see perfectly every detail of the cave etched in sharp relief, the rough walls, the stalactites hanging like teeth, the dust motes dancing in the air where Gideon disturbed them. Gideon moved beside her, a shadow in the shadows, his breathing the only clue to his position. He didn't light a torch. He sat with his back against the wall and trusted her to keep him safe. This was different from the farmhouse weeks ago. Then it had been alliance, necessity, a temporary truce against a common enemy. Now it was something else. The cave was smaller, more intimate. She could hear his heartbeat, slow, steady, alive. A rhythm she'd memorized without trying. She'd listened to thousands of heartbeats in her life, counting them as lives passed through her fingers. This was the only one that had ever sounded like home. You're not afraid? She asked, her voice barely a whisper in the darkness. I trust you, he said simply. The words landed in the space between them with more weight than any weapon. Why? Because you could have killed me when I was vulnerable, you didn't. Sable was quiet for a moment. I wanted to. I know, he said, his voice gentle, but you didn't. They talked in the dark, small things that felt monumental in the confined space. He told her he couldn't cook, that his attempts at making breakfast usually resulted in smoke alarms and charred remnants. She told him she hadn't tried to cook in 200 years, that the concept of fire for anything other than warmth or destruction was still foreign. He told her about a dog he'd had as a child, a mangy mutt with one ear that had followed him home one day and never left. She told him about the first time she'd seen an automobile and thought it was a demon, a metal beast that breathed smoke and fire. They laughed, actually laughed. The sound echoed in the cave, bouncing off the walls, filling the space with something that felt suspiciously like joy. When the laughter faded, there was a silence that wasn't awkward, it was full. Sable moved closer, not with the predatory grace of her kind, but with deliberate slowness, giving him time to stop her, to push her away, to remind her of what she was. He didn't stop her. She rested her head against his shoulder. He was warm, she was cold. The contrast was sharp and perfect, like fire and ice meeting to create steam. He put his arm around her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, not possessive, just present. They stayed like that as dawn broke outside, light creeping across the cave floor inch by inch. She didn't burn because she was deep enough in the stone, far enough from the direct light. His warmth beside her, her stillness beside him. The silence stretched between them, comfortable now, no longer a void to be filled but a space to be inhabited. Gideon's breathing evened out, his body relaxing against hers. Sleep was taking him, pulling him under. Just before he slipped completely, his voice was a whisper against her hair, soft and sleepy and full of something that made her chest ache. "When this is all over," he murmured, "the ambassador work, the politics, all of it, I want to build something, a house maybe, on the border." Sable didn't answer, but she didn't move away, and her fingers found his and held on. The shutters clicked into place, one by one, each panel crafted from reinforced oak with silver inlays along the edges. The shutters clicked into place, one by one, each panel crafted from reinforced oak with silver inlays along the edges. Gideon had spent 3 days on them, measuring, cutting, fitting. Sable hadn't asked. She hadn't even mentioned the way the morning light sometimes made her flinch when it slipped through the gaps in the old wooden shutters. He just did it, working quietly while she slept through the day, his movements precise and economical. When she woke that evening and found the room transformed in shadow, she had touched the wood with her fingertips, tracing the silver veins that ran through the grain. No words were needed. That was how they worked now, small gestures that spoke volumes. The house stood exactly on the border, its stone foundation straddling the invisible line between vampire territory to the north and werewolf territory to the south. The forest behind them was neutral ground now, claimed by neither side, a buffer zone maintained by the treaty that had seemed impossible just months before. It was a humble place with thick stone walls that held the chill of night and a heavy oak door that could withstand almost anything. It was neither a vampire's crypt nor a hunter's lodge. It was something new. Their days followed a rhythm that was both familiar and strange. They still hunted, though the hybrids were fewer now, remnants of Corvin's distributed serum that occasionally surfaced in the wild. When they did, they moved together as if they'd been fighting side by side for a lifetime, not months. Sable's speed would draw the abomination's attention, her curved blades flashing in the moonlight as she danced around its unnatural limbs, while Gideon moved with the patience of a stonecutter, his silver weapons finding the gaps in the hybrid's armored hide. They were efficient. They were deadly, they were unstoppable, but hunting was only part of their duty now. They were ambassadors, a role that had been thrust upon them but which they had embraced with the same determination they brought to every fight. The negotiations were slow, tedious work. Vampires viewed werewolves as impulsive, rage-driven brutes. Werewolves saw vampires as cowards who hid from the sun and preyed on the helpless. Sable and Gideon were living proof that both stereotypes were wrong. Just by walking into a room together, they challenged centuries of prejudice. Last week they had attended a meeting with Lady Vera and the werewolf Alpha Grayson. The air in the old stone fortress had been thick with tension, the scent of old blood and simmering hostility. When a young werewolf had snarled at a vampire elder, Sable had stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying the weight of 2 centuries of command. "He is not your enemy," she had said, her red eyes fixed on the werewolf. "Neither am I." Gideon had placed a hand on the hilt of his greatsword, not to draw it, but as a silent promise of protection. The gesture had been noticed. The meeting had continued, small steps but steps nonetheless. Tonight there was no meeting, no hunting, just the quiet of the house and the full moon hanging heavy in the sky. Gideon stood by the window watching the silver light wash over the forest. He had built a fire in the hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Sable sat in a chair nearby, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap, but her gaze was distant, unfocused. She needed to feed. She needed to feed. He could smell it on her, a subtle tang of copper beneath the scent of pine and night air. She had been drinking animal blood lately, supplemented by donations from Vera's coven, but it wasn't enough. It never was. Human blood was what sustained her, what kept the beast at bay. And tonight she was looking at him in a way that told him she wanted his. Sable watched Gideon through the window, her breath visible in the cool night air. The moonlight did something to him, sharpening the lines of his face, making his eyes seem brighter, more alert. He stood straighter under its gaze, his hand resting on the hilt of his greatsword, not out of tension but out of habit. She had asked him once during one of their first hunts together why he didn't transform when the moon was full. Werewolves were creatures of the moon, after all. He had looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "I never wanted to be the thing that killed my parents," he had said, his voice low. "I wanted to be the thing that protects people from it." She understood that better than he knew. She had spent 2 centuries being the thing that had killed her sister, or at least the thing that had failed to save her. The guilt was a constant companion, a cold weight in her chest that no amount of blood or battle could erase. In some ways, Gideon's self-imposed limitation was similar. He had denied a fundamental part of himself to honor a promise made to a dying woman. It was a form of penance, just as her eternal vigilance was hers. The need for blood was a physical ache now, a low thrum in her veins that matched the rhythm of her own heart. She could smell his pulse steady and strong beneath his skin. It was a tempting melody, a song she had heard 1,000 times before but never with this particular longing. This wasn't hunger for sustenance, it was something else, something that scared her more than any hybrid or hunter's blade. He turned from the window, his gaze finding hers. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. He crossed the room to her, his movements sure and silent. When he stood before her, he reached up and unbuttoned the collar of his shirt, the fabric parting to reveal the strong line of his throat. He tilted his head to the side, exposing the vulnerable curve where his pulse beat against his skin, not because she demanded it, because he offered. Her fangs extended, sharp and aching. A tremor ran through her. This was intimacy of a different kind, more dangerous than any battle. She had fed on humans before from willing donors, but she had never fed on someone she cared about. The thought made her chest tight. What if she lost control? What if the beast inside her, the predator that had taken her sister, decided that this warm, trusting offering was too much to resist? He seemed to sense her hesitation. His hand came up, warm and steady, and rested on the back of her neck. His thumb stroked her skin, grounding her, anchoring her to the moment. "I trust you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The words struck her like a physical blow. No one had trusted her in 200 years, not since her sister. She leaned into his touch, her breath catching. Her fangs brushed against his skin, and he shuddered, not in fear but in anticipation. She bit. The first taste was always the shock of it, the coppery rush of life, the heat of his blood, the unique flavor that was undeniably, achingly him. The first taste was always the shock of it, the coppery rush of life, the heat of his blood, the unique flavor that was undeniably, achingly him. It was nothing like hunting. There was no struggle, no fear, no death. Only the slow, careful intimacy of sharing something precious. She took only what she needed, her movements precise, controlled. She could feel his strength flowing into her, mingling with her own power, and she could feel her own resilience flowing into him, a temporary gift of her longevity. When she finally pulled back, her lips were stained red, his blood a stark contrast against her pale skin. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow, but there was no pain on his face, only a dazed sort of peace. He reached up and touched his throat, his fingers coming away with a smear of crimson. He looked at it, then looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "See," he said, his voice thick, "no harm done." She had never heard those words from anyone in 200 years. No harm done. It was as simple and as impossible as that. They stood outside the house under a sky full of stars, the air crisp and clean. The border ran through the forest behind them, a dark line dividing two worlds, but here in this small clearing there was only peace. Sable leaned against the heavy oak doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the moonlight filter through the trees. Gideon stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, a silent presence that was more comforting than any words could be. "1,000 years of war," she said softly, her voice barely carrying in the stillness. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the stars. "And it took one mad alchemist to make us stop." A laugh escaped her, a real, genuine laugh that surprised even her. She hadn't laughed in decades, not since before her turning, not since before the world had become a place of hunters and hunted. The sound was foreign in her own ears, but it felt good. It felt right. He turned his head, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. In the moonlight, her eyes glowed faintly red like embers in the night. His silver pendant caught the starlight, a small, steady beacon against his skin. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. Cold fingers and warm, two predators who had spent their whole lives fighting everything, finally standing still for each other. He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a kiss there, a gesture of tenderness in a world that knew little of it. "I would have spent my whole life hunting your kind," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And you would have spent yours avoiding mine, but we found each other instead." She turned her hand, lacing her fingers with his. "We did," she agreed, her voice thick, "and I wouldn't change a single moment of it." They stood like that for a long time, two souls bound by blood and moonlight, by war and peace, by the impossible, undeniable truth that they had found something better than they had ever dared to hope for. The night was around them, vast and ancient, but in this small space, on this thin line between worlds, they had built something new, something that would last. Under the watchful eye of the moon, they had found their own peace, and this time it was enough, forever.